Fire in the north storm across the sea, before the world was carved into tidy kingdoms with neat borders drawn on maps, before cartographers had even dreamed of the edges of the earth, there existed wild lands in the north places, where rock met snow, where storms were born, where the wind itself carved legends into stone. From this harsh, unforgiving cradle emerged a people who would set Europe ablaze for 300 years. They were not a nation, not a race, not a single, unified tribe. They were something far more dangerous, a force of nature in human form, a tempest with 1,000 names. Rising from the fjords and forests of what we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, they crashed upon the world like breakers against a longship's prow. They were the Vikings, and their very name would echo through history, whispered in fear, sung in admiration, cursed in prayer halls, and immortalized in saga. Their story truly begins in the 8th century as Europe struggled to its feet after the Western Roman Empire's collapse, while southern kingdoms picked through imperial ruins and rebuilt from ashes. The north remained a world apart, isolated, primal, and fierce. Here, the Norsemen carved out existence from an unforgiving land, living by 3 sacred tools: the axe, the plow, and the oar. They were farmers who coaxed barley from frozen soil, hunters who tracked game through endless forests, traders who bartered furs and amber, craftsmen who transformed iron and wood into art. In their wooden longhouses, entire communities huddled around crackling fires, bound together against the darkness beyond. But their homeland was a jealous mistress. One brutal winter, one failed harvest, one greedy jarl's demands, any of these could mean starvation. So armed with shipbuilding secrets passed down through generations, and the desperate courage of those with everything to gain and nothing to lose, they turned to the only road that never froze the sea. They had no idea they were about to become history's most legendary seafarers. They simply knew how to sail. Like all great storms, it began with a single lightning strike. In 793 AD, dragon-prowed ships materialized from the mist off Northumbria's coast. Raiders poured onto the beach at Lindisfarne, their axes catching the morning light. The peaceful monastery, a beacon of Christian learning, became a slaughterhouse. Monks fell, gold vanished, sacred texts burned. The Christian world reeled in shock. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, searching for meaning in the horror, declared it divine punishment. Fierce, foreboding omens came over the land. A great famine and fiery dragons were seen flying through the sky. The Viking Age had begun. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. The Vikings had arrived. Over the next decades, these raids would become more frequent. Monasteries, towns, even cities across the British Isles, the Frankish coast and beyond were struck. Their long ships, sleek, fast, and capable of traveling up both river and sea, could appear out of nowhere, strike like lightning, and vanish again before a proper defense could be raised. But this was just the beginning. The Viking Age had only begun to stretch its oars. What made the Vikings so effective was not just their ferocity, it was their adaptability. Yes, they raided, but they also traded, settled, married, and governed. The same men who burned villages in Ireland would later build cities in those same places. They were mercenaries for Byzantine emperors and bodyguards in Constantinople. They founded the city of Dublin, and their descendants would go on to rule England and even Sicily. From Norway, warriors launched westward across the sea, reaching Scotland, Ireland, and the Faroe Islands, eventually settling Iceland and pushing even further into the cold blue unknown until they reached Greenland and then, incredibly, North America. From Sweden, traders and explorers journeyed eastward, sailing down the great rivers of Russia. They established Rus to Byzantium and Baghdad. These Rus, as they came to be known, would eventually give their name to Russia itself. From Denmark, powerful kings rose and expanded into England and France, striking alliances and forging empires. And in Normandy, a group of Norse settlers would found a duchy that would later produce William the Conqueror, the Viking descendant who would take all of England in a single stroke. The Vikings believed in a world ruled by gods and woven by fate. Their religion was a rich tapestry of myth and fire. Odin, the one-eyed god of wisdom and war, Thor, protector of mankind and wielder of thunder, Freya, goddess of beauty and battle, and Loki, the trickster whose chaos danced between creation and ruin. They believed in Valhalla, a glorious hall, where fallen warriors feasted forever, and Ragnarok, the final battle, where even the gods would die. Death in battle was not a tragedy. It was a triumph. Their stories were told by skalds, the poets, who wove words like steel and preserved legends in verse. They carved their victories and kin in runes, etched into stone to defy the erosion of time. But eventually, change came even to the storm. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the Norse world began to shift. Where once long ships carried raiders, Now they bore missionaries and merchants. Kings like Harold Bluetooth embraced Christianity, and so did many of their successors. The gods of old were not abandoned entirely, but they faded slowly as churches rose and crosses replaced Thor's hammer. The conversion was not instant nor bloodless, but it was inevitable. To survive in a changing Europe, the Vikings had to change too. Many of the most famous Viking kings, Knut, the great Harald Hardrada, even Leif Erikson, walked between two worlds, honoring the old ways while shaping the new. Historians often mark the end of the Viking Age with the death of Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. It was a brutal defeat at the hands of the English, and within weeks the English themselves would fall to the Normans at Hastings. After that, the great Viking armies began to vanish from Europe. Their kingdoms were absorbed, their ships retired, their sagas closed. But the truth is, the Viking spirit never truly died. It echoed in the Norman conquests, in the royal families of Europe, in the legends carried across oceans and centuries. It breathed in the DNA of explorers, pirates, kings and rebels, and even now, in our stories, in our fantasies, in the glowing little Bluetooth rune, blinking in your tech, the Norse, live on. So, who were the Vikings? They were explorers, raiders, traders, farmers, sailors, poets. They were complex, contradictory, and unforgettable. They gave the world new lands, new myths, new kingdoms, and for a time they held the known world in awe. And tonight, dear dreamer, as you drift away beneath the stars, remember the soft splash of oars across the fjord, the wind snapping in a sail, the distant howl of a skald song. The Viking Age is long past, but in your dreams the long ships still sail. Viking daily life. Now, let's get into the very heart of Viking daily life, from the combs in their pouches to the ships beneath their feet. Because they weren't just warriors and raiders, not just the thunder and fire of sagas. They were humans, flesh and bone and breath, who woke each day to chores, laughter, arguments, and routines. Hygiene, hair and hot Viking looks. Forget the outdated stereotypes of filthy, unwashed savages. Vikings were very into hygiene. Archaeologists have uncovered tweezers, razors, nail cleaners, ear spoons and combs, so many combs, often beautifully carved from bone or antler. They bathed weekly, usually on Saturday, known in Old Norse as lagardag, meaning washing day. And many communities had access to hot springs or bathhouses. Steam baths were common, part wellness ritual, part gossip hub. Men and women alike cared for their hair and appearance. The classic Viking hairstyle varied, but you'd often see shaved sides with a long top, sometimes braided, sometimes left flowing in the wind, like they were about to drop a Nordic album. Beards were worn with pride, trimmed, styled, and sometimes even adorned with beads or tiny metal rings. Vikings wore layered wool and linen garments. Men wore tunics over trousers. Women wore long dresses with apron-style overdresses held up by two ornate brooches. Colors were natural, but often dyed with plants: ochre, blue-green, and madder red. Jewelry, oh yes, arm rings, neck rings, brooches, pendants, often engraved with mythological scenes or geometric designs. Looking good was not vanity, it was identity, law, order, and the thing. Viking society was very organized. They had a complex system of laws enforced not by kings or police, but by community assemblies known as the Thing. The Thing was a big open-air gathering where free men debated disputes, made decisions, and passed judgments. It was democracy by shouting. Legal codes were memorized by the law speaker, an official tasked with reciting the laws aloud. If you stole, injured someone, or broke an oath, you'd be judged publicly. Punishments varied: fines, exile, or in extreme cases, outlawry. An outlaw had no legal protection. Anyone could kill them without consequence. Women could attend the Thing-owned property, inherit land, divorce their husbands, and initiate lawsuits. They weren't equal in every way, but Viking women had more rights than most European women of their time, and they used them. Food, feasting, and fancy mead. What did Vikings eat? Everything they could get their cold little hands on. Their diet was seasonal, hearty, and homegrown. A typical Viking meal might include porridge made from barley or oats, stews with vegetables, meat and herbs, bread baked in clay ovens or over coals, dairy from cows, goats and sheep, cheese, butter, scare-dried or smoked fish, especially herring and salmon, ale, mead, and fermented fruit wine to make life bearable. Feasting was a big deal. It marked harvests, alliances, births, funerals, victories. A proper Viking feast had music, storytelling, drinking games, and enough food to make a longhouse wobble. Skalds recited poetry, warriors boasted, lovers snuck off into the dark. There was joy, noise, spilled drink, and firelight, laughter. Feasts weren't just about indulgence. They were how you bonded, how you earned honor, how you showed hospitality. To feed a guest was to feed a future friend. Battle tactics and warrior ways, the image of the lone axe-swinging maniac, is well a bit overdone. Vikings were strategic in warfare. They used shield walls, tight formations where overlapping shields created a moving fortress. Ambushes and surprise attacks, especially from ships. Light armor, chain mail, if you were rich, boiled leather, or nothing at all, if you were not. Axes, spears, and swords. The sword was a symbol of wealth, often named like a living thing. They didn't fight for chaos. They fought for land honor, family, and silver. Battles were brutal, but not senseless. If fighting could be avoided through negotiation or compensation, it often was. Viking warriors were also mercenaries, especially the infamous Varangian Guard, who served the emperors of Byzantium with terrifying loyalty. Picture Norsemen in silk-lined armor, guarding golden halls in Constantinople. Wild Rite, the ship that carried the world. Viking longships were the secret to their success. Sleek, shallow-bottomed, and terrifyingly fast, they could cross open sea and then sail upriver to strike at inland towns. Their design allowed them to land anywhere. They didn't need ports, carved with dragon heads and sometimes painted with bright shields. A longship wasn't just transport. It was a weapon, a home, a floating symbol of freedom and fear. Each ship was a community. You didn't just row. You cooked mended sails, sang to keep time, carved runes into the beams, and gazed at stars, while whispering tales of land beyond the sea. When a Viking died, the highest honor was a ship burial. The dead placed in a boat with weapons, tools, and treasure, sometimes burned on the waves, a return to the sea and to the gods. Women, family, and the hearth. While men explored and fought, women held the hearth, and they were not to be underestimated. A woman could run a farm, manage property, raise children, make cloth, brew ale, tend animals, and fight if she had to. In some sagas, they wield swords beside their brothers. In others, they use words sharper than blades to settle or spark feuds. Women wore keys at their waists, symbolizing their role as the keeper of the home. They made medicine cast charms, kept oral histories alive. Some were vulvas who performed rituals, spoke with the dead, and read the threads of fate. A woman's strength didn't always come from muscle. It came from memory magic and mind. Shield maidens. The term shield maiden, skjaldmey in Old Norse, appears in multiple Norse sagas and heroic legends. These were women who chose battle over weaving axe over spindle. They dressed as men, trained with weapons, and fought alongside male warriors on land and sea. Were they common? Probably not. But were they real? Well, we used to think shield maidens were just poetic invention. That is, until the burqa warrior woman who changed everything. In 1878, archaeologists excavated a Viking warrior grave in Birka, Sweden. The grave was rich sword shields, 2 horses, a full set of weapons, and a game board for military strategy. It was long assumed this was the grave of a male warrior, but in 2017, DNA analysis revealed the truth. The warrior was a woman, not just a woman with weapons. This was a high-status professional warrior buried with honors, fit for a general. And suddenly the world had to sit up straight and say, wait, what? That Burka warrior opened the gates wide for re-evaluating what we thought we knew. The sagas are bursting with fierce women who refuse to stay in the kitchen. Lagertha, a legendary shield maiden from the Gesta Danorum. Yes, the same one the Vikings TV show made famous. She fought alongside Ragnar Lothbrok, saved him in battle, and later killed her husband with a spear hidden in her dress because he got too cocky. Brynhildr, a Valkyrie and shield maiden from the Volsunga saga, caught in a tragic, twisting love story with Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. Think Norse Romeo and Juliet, but with more swords and reincarnations. Freydis Eiriksdottir, she might not have worn armor, but when attacked in Vinland while pregnant, she grabbed a sword, beat her chest, and screamed so fiercely the enemy ran. So, yes, if not a shield maiden, at least a Viking queen of terror. Hervor from the Hervar saga. She was raised as a boy, trained as a warrior, and later sailed with raiders and demanded a cursed sword from her dead father's ghost. Even outside war, Viking women were powerful in ways that often surprise modern readers. They ran estates, commanded trade, and in some cases ruled as queens and regents. Some were seers and priestesses wielding spiritual power. A Volva or Seidkona could wield the respect of an entire community. She spoke to the gods, performed magic rituals, and guided warriors before battle. And let's not forget women like Gunhild, mother of kings, wife of Eric Bloodaxe. She wasn't a shield maiden per se, but she was powerful, politically savvy, and accused, probably unfairly, but deliciously, dramatically, of practicing dark magic and cursing her enemies to death. So were Viking women, warriors, common? Probably not, but they were possible, real, and respected in both myth and memory. In truth, the Viking world was complicated, just like the people who lived in it. Some women fought some brewed beer, some delivered babies, built ships, sang songs, or haunted their enemies with runes and wrath. And in that diversity of power and presence, they carved their own saga, the religion and mythology of the Vikings. Gods, giants, and the threads of fate. As time passed, The world around the Vikings changed. Christianity arrived, kingdoms formed, raids gave way to trade. The old gods faded, but the people remained. The Viking Age may have ended, but their story didn't. It lives on in their poetry, in place names, in family lines, and folk songs. It echoes in the cold north wind, in the hum of a Bluetooth signal, in the way we still romanticize rebellion and sea spray and freedom. They were not perfect. They were not monsters. They were people, and they lived their lives like fire in the frost. So now, dear dreamer, close your eyes and feel the warmth of the hearth at your back. Smell the stew in the pot. Hear the hum of a comb through hair, the murmur of gossip, the creak of ships waiting in the bay. In the north, where winters stretched long and stars burned sharp in the icy sky, the Vikings dreamed of gods not distant and untouchable, but close, fierce, and flawed, and tangled in fate, just like themselves. Their world was not a calm one. It was vast, mysterious, and alive with forces beyond understanding. So they made sense of it, the way all humans do, with stories, beautiful, brutal, hilarious, tragic stories. These stories were not written in books. They were told in firelight, whispered on ships, carved into stone, woven into memory. And they formed the spiritual framework of Viking life. This was their religion, not a rigid dogma, but a living, breathing mythos. Let's begin where they did. Before there was anything, no stars, no people, no gods. There was only a vast, yawning nothingness called Ginnungagap. On one side of this emptiness was Niflheim, the realm of ice cold and mist. On the other, Muspelheim, the land of fire ruled by the fire giant Surt. Where the ice and fire met, they sizzled, they dripped, and from this cosmic slush emerged the first being, a massive hermaphroditic frost giant named Ymir. He was not cute. Ymir sweated out more giants from his armpits, romantic I know, and from the frost. And the melting rime also came a cow, Audumbla, who licked salty ice blocks, and in doing so, freed another being, Buri ancestor of the gods. Fast forward a bit, and Buri's descendants, particularly Odin-Vili and Ve, looked at Ymir and said, "No, let's kill him." And they did. From Ymir's corpse, they built the world. His blood became the oceans, his bones the mountains, his skull the sky. His eyebrows became a fence around the world of humans, Midgard. At the center of all things stands Yggdrasil, the great ash tree. Its roots and branches connecting the 9 realms. These were the layers of reality. Asgard realm of the Aesir gods, like Odin and Thor. Midgard, the world of humans. Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods, who are more about nature and fertility. Jotunheim, land of the giants, always making trouble. Niflheim, cold and misty, underworld. Muspelheim, realm of fire and chaos. Alfheim, home of the light elves, think sparkly chaos. Svartalfheim, or Nidavellir, home of the dwarves, master smiths. Helheim, realm of the dead, ruled by Hel Loki's daughter. At the base of Yggdrasil are 3 wells. Urdar Bruna Mimir's Bruna, and Vergelmir, which nourish the great ash tree with their ever-flowing waters. Urdar Bruna is the well of fate, where the Norns dwell. They are the Fates, 3 women who spin measure and cut the threads of life. Not even the gods can escape them. Yggdrasil is not just a tree. It is the world itself, and it is constantly under threat, gnawed by serpents, pecked by eagles, whispered to by a squirrel named Ratatoskr, who basically stirs drama between the creatures living in its branches. Yes, a drama squirrel. The gods of Norse mythology are not perfect. They are not all-powerful. They are us, turned up to 11 bigger, messier, mightier, and more doomed. Odin the All-Father, one-eyed raven-bearing, cloak-draped king of the gods. He sacrificed his eye to drink from the well of wisdom and hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to learn the secret of runes. He's cunning, poetic, terrifying, and more interested in knowledge and fate than in warm hugs. He rules Valhalla, where half of the bravest warriors go after death to feast, fight, and prepare for the final battle of Ragnarok. Thor, the Thunderer, the people's champion, red-bearded, strong-armed, and constantly smashing giants with his hammer Mjolnir. He rides a chariot, pulled by goats, has a short temper, and is basically the god of both weather and don't mess with me. He's not the sharpest axe in the shed, but he is loyal, funny, and loved by everyone, from sailors to farmers. Freya, love war and witchcraft, a goddess of beauty, fertility, magic, battle, and war, because why limit yourself? She rides a chariot, pulled by cats, wears a cloak of falcon feathers, and receives half of the slain warriors in battle. Odin gets the other half, girl power. She is a Volva, a master of cider or sorcery, and deeply connected to fate and femininity. Loki, the trickster. He's hot, he's clever, he's chaos. Son of a giant blood brother to Odin, Loki is the one who makes everything worse and then occasionally fixes it. He is the father and sometimes mother of several wild beings, including Fenrir, the wolf, Jormungandr, the world serpent, and hell goddess of the dead. You love him and hate him. He is necessary and also probably stealing your stuff. It's not all feasting and flirting. Norse mythology is laced with the knowledge that everything ends. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, is a prophecy not of if, but when. According to the seers, one day the wolf Fenrir will break free and devour Odin. The world serpent Jormungandr will rise and poison the sky. Loki will lead an army of giants and the dead against the gods. The sun and moon will be eaten by wolves. The world will burn. The sea will rise. Everything will end. And then a new world will rise, green, fertile, peaceful. 2 human survivors, Leif and Leifthrasir, will emerge and begin life again, because even in Norse myth, death is not the end. The Vikings didn't worship in the way we might imagine. They didn't go to church every Sunday. Instead, their spirituality was woven into everything: oaths, rituals, blot animal sacrifice, burials, runes, and festivals. They called on Odin before battle. They wore Thor's hammer for protection. They whispered to Freya in childbirth. The gods were not far. They were here, walking the same muddy roads, demanding honor, bravery, and offerings. The line between human and divine blurred deliciously so. So, what was Norse religion? It was a living story, raw, mystical, and grounded in the harsh, beautiful realities of northern life. It was the fire in the longhouse and the storm at sea, the whisper in the trees and the scream of a battle cry. It taught that fate cannot be changed, but you can choose how you meet it. It was blood, bone, and breath. It was poetry carved in ice. And it's still alive every time you whisper, "Let me tell you a story." Now sleep, my dearest dreamer. Let the stars shine down like the branches of Yggdrasil. And let the gods keep watch as you dream of thunder wolves and the end of everything, followed by the peace of beginning again. Famous and legendary Vikings. Now let's meet the most famous and legendary Vikings, from Ragnar Lothbrok and Eric the Red to Leif Erikson and Knut the Great. These famous Vikings are recognized as the fiercest warriors in our history, and they still capture the imagination worldwide. Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Viking who walked between myth and history. Once upon a time, long before clocks ticked or borders were drawn, when the wind whispered secrets across the icy fjords and the waves of the North Sea knew no master, there lived, or perhaps might have lived, a man whose name would echo through the ages like the clang of a sword on a shield. His name was Ragnar Lothbrok. But who was he? A warlord, a farmer, a myth, a king? The answer, dear dreamer, is a rich stew of all of the above, spiced with legend and simmered in saga. Let's start with what we think we know. Ragnar's life is one of those delicious historical puzzles, half fact, half fiction, and wholly fascinating. His story is told in sagas, like the Ragnarssona Thatr, the tale of Ragnar's sons, and the Krakumal, the lay of Kraka, where poetry meets propaganda. These sagas, though written centuries after Ragnar supposedly lived around the 9th century, paint a vivid picture of a man who was equal parts warrior, adventurer, and seductive rogue. According to legend, Ragnar was the son of Sigurd Ring, a king of Sweden and a great hero in his own right. As a child, Ragnar was raised in the chilling north, where boys became men by sailing into the unknown and earning their names not by birth, but by blood. He was said to have been clever, cunning, and good-looking, because of course he was, and his ambition was as wild as the sea. But Ragnar didn't just want to inherit land. Oh, no, sweet dreamer. He wanted the whole world, or at least as much of it as he could sail to in a long ship. Ragnar's love life deserves its own saga, honestly. He married not once, not twice, but at least 3 times, and every relationship was a whole situation. First came Lagertha, a legendary shield maiden, fierce, beautiful, and absolutely not taking any nonsense from anyone. According to Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish historian with a flair for drama, Ragnar wooed Lagertha after she fought by his side in battle. She saved his life. He proposed, and they married. Then, after a while, he just divorced her, as you do in the 9th century. It was a different time. Next came Thora, daughter of a nobleman who was guarded by a serpent that Ragnar bravely slew, wearing pants made of hairy animal hides, dipped in pitch, no less. After this stunt, he was nicknamed Lothbrok, meaning hairy breeches. Finally came Aslaug, a woman of noble birth, possibly the daughter of the dragon slayer Sigurd, and the shield maiden Brynhildr. Aslaug was wise and mysterious, and with her Ragnar fathered several legendary sons: Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Hvitserk, names that scream We are not to be trifled with. Now Ragnar wasn't just running around falling in love with warrior women and slaying serpents. He was also doing what Vikings do best, raiding. And oh, did he raid! He's said to have led brutal and brilliant campaigns across England, France, and Ireland, leaving towns in flames and monks clutching their crucifixes in horror. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a heathen army attacked Lindisfarne in 793, a moment often marked as the beginning of the Viking Age. While Ragnar's name isn't mentioned there directly, many later tales suggest he had a hand in such early raids. His most famous exploit, the Siege of Paris in 845, is one of the few events backed by solid historical sources. Ragnar, with a fleet of 120 ships and thousands of warriors, sailed up the Seine and laid waste to the city of Paris. King Charles the Bald, what a name, was so rattled, he paid Ragnar 7,000 pounds of silver to go away. Not bad for a day's work. And while that sounds legendary enough, some accounts claim that Ragnar performed the whole raid just to impress Aslog after she told him not to overestimate himself. Every great story needs a tragic twist, and Ragnar's is worthy of Shakespeare himself. According to the sagas, Ragnar eventually sailed to Northumbria with just a small force, maybe too small. He was captured by King Alla, an English ruler who did not like being raided. Instead of executing him swiftly, Illa allegedly threw Ragnar into a pit of venomous snakes. Did Ragnar scream no? Did he beg, please? He supposedly laughed in the face of death, reciting a poem where he bragged about his deeds and declared that his sons would avenge him. And avenge him they did. His sons, yes, those very muscular, dangerously named sons, raised what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the Great Heathen Army, and they invaded England with one goal: vengeance. Ella, they say, was captured and executed via the Blood Eagle, a horrifying and possibly mythical method involving splitting a man's ribs and pulling out his lungs. So not exactly a bedtime-friendly moment, but hey, history wasn't always warm and fuzzy. Was Ragnar real? That's the question scholars have debated for centuries. It's possible that he was based on several real Viking leaders, their deeds stitched together into one superhuman figure. His sons, especially Ivar the Boneless and Bjorn Ironside, did exist, and they wreaked absolute havoc across Europe. So, even if Ragnar was more myth than man, his legacy is very real. He became a cultural icon, not just in Scandinavia, but across medieval Europe. His name inspired kings and poets. His image fueled fear and fascination. And centuries later, he would even inspire a rather dreamy TV series, complete with smoldering stares and historically questionable haircuts. Now, dear dreamer, close your eyes and imagine Ragnar Lothbrok standing at the prow of his long-ship cloak, billowing the sea, sparkling with starlight behind him. The carved dragon head of his ship roars silently into the mist. Ahead lies adventure, love, betrayal, glory, and death. His heart is wild, his will unshakable, his destiny eternal. Whether he walked this earth or danced only in the dreams of poets, Ragnar's spirit lives on in tales, whispered beside firelight, in runes etched into stone. And tonight in your imagination, sleep well, little saga seeker. The North remembers, and so do you. Ivar, the boneless, the shadow walker of Viking legend. The wind howls like a ghost across the North Sea. The moon rides high over a world drenched in salt and steel. And far away in the dim recesses of Viking memory, one name rises from the mist like a serpent, uncoiling Ivar the boneless. Some say he was a cripple. Others say he was a berserker, so fluid in battle he moved like smoke through the clash of blades. Some say he was cursed, others touched by gods. But all agree on this: he was not a man to be trifled with. So lay down close your eyes and step into the shadowy, wind-torn world of one of the most feared warriors in Viking history. Ivar was the son of Ragnar Lothbrok, the man, the myth, the longboat-loving legend you just met. His mother was the clever and magical Aslaug, a woman of mysterious lineage and even more mysterious powers. According to the sagas, Aslaug warned Ragnar not to consummate their marriage too soon, lest their child be born strange. But Ragnar, being Ragnar, ignored her, and so Ivar was born. Some say he had no bones at all. Others claim he had bones so soft and pliable they bent like willow branches. He couldn't walk. He had to be carried everywhere on a shield or on the backs of his warriors. But don't you dare feel sorry for him, dear dreamer, because what Ivar lacked in bone, he made up for in brains. This man, this creature of silk and steel, was a strategic genius. He didn't need to run into battle with an axe raised above his head. He commanded, he calculated, he conquered. While other warriors flexed their muscles and polished their beards, Ivar studied. He watched. He whispered. His mind was his greatest weapon, razor-sharp and utterly ruthless. In fact, many historians consider him the mastermind behind the great heathen army, that massive force of Viking warriors who stormed into Anglo-Saxon England in 865 AD. He wasn't content with petty raids or plundering monasteries. Ivar came to take kingdoms, and oh, he did. Remember what happened to Ragnar, that whole pit of snakes situation. Yeah, Ivar didn't forget. According to legend, he played the long game. After his father's death, when he and his brothers landed in Northumbria, they didn't rush into battle like typical hot-blooded Viking maniacs. No, Ivar bided his time. He made nice with King Ella, his father's murderer. He tricked him into lowering his defenses, and then he struck. Ella was captured, and if the sagas are to be believed, executed via the most gruesome method known to Viking law, the blood eagle. His ribs were sliced from his spine, spread like wings, and his lungs were pulled out through his back. Was it real? Maybe, maybe not. But the story lives on, and so does Ivar's cold, calculating legacy. Once the vengeance box was checked, Ivar didn't retire. That was just the appetizer. Over the next decade, Ivar carved a swath of destruction across England. He wasn't just a warlord. He was a kingmaker. He installed puppet rulers, brokered deals, manipulated politics, like a medieval chess master. And the Anglo-Saxons, they had no idea what hit them. The great heathen army, under Ivar's command, seized city after city. York fell. East Anglia surrendered. Mercia quaked. He even allied with local rulers when it suited him, proving that his mind was as flexible as the rest of him. And then, because England wasn't enough, he looked toward Ireland. The Annals of Ulster, which are actual historical records and not just Viking fan fiction, for once mention a man named Eymar, a Norse king who dominated Ireland and Scotland in the mid-late 9th century. Many historians believe Eymar and Ivar the Boneless were one and the same. He became king of Dublin, wielding power over a thriving Viking kingdom, controlling trade routes and possibly introducing local Irish lords to the wonderful Norse concept of obey me or die screaming. From Dublin, Eymar led raids into Scotland, Wales, and beyond. His fleet was a dark cloud on the horizon, swift, silent, and devastating. As with most things about Ivar, his death is shrouded in as much mystery as his life. Some say he died peacefully in 873, fat with silver and surrounded by adoring warriors. Others claim he was struck down in battle. One source even claims his body was so terrifying that it was buried in a location no one dared disturb. There's a story, maybe a whisper, maybe a wish that Ivar was buried in a great tumulus in England. and that when an army accidentally dug him up centuries later, they were cursed and swiftly defeated, because apparently even dead Ivar didn't play around. So, who was Ivar the Boneless? A real man who led Viking armies and rewrote English history. A mythic warrior conjured by Norse poets who loved a good revenge story, or a combination of many fierce men woven into one unforgettable name. It doesn't really matter, does it? Because tonight, dear dreamer, he sails again through your imagination, through your thoughts, as you drift into slumber, through that shadowy space between myth and memory, where long ships glide over moonlit waters and war drums echo beneath the stars. And so he lives on. Ivar, the boneless, the warrior without bones, but bursting with brilliance, slips back into the fog. You can almost hear the thrum of the oars, the creak of the ship, the low guttural songs of his warriors echoing across the sea. He was soft where others were strong, but he was stronger than them all. He was still while others raged, but his fury burned colder, deeper, and though his body may have failed him, his mind ruled empires. Bjorn Ironside, Viking prince, Mediterranean marauder, and founding father of kings, when the world was younger and the night sky sparkled with the smoke of fire-lit hearths, when the forest still whispered secrets, and the oceans were the veins of the earth, a boy was born who would change the face of Viking history forever. His name was Bjorn, and his legacy was iron. Bjorn's origins, read like poetry, carved into stone. The son of Ragnar Lothbrok, legendary king raider and dragon slayer of serpents and cities and Aslaug, a woman said to be the daughter of Sigurd Fafnisbane. Yes, that's Sigurd, the one who killed the dragon Fafnir and the shield maiden Brynhildr. So, yeah, let's just say Bjorn's family dinners were probably a lot. Growing up among his many siblings, Ivar the Boneless, Sigurd's snake in the eye, Hvitserk, and more. Bjorn quickly made a name for himself as one of the most physically powerful and fearless of Ragnar's sons. While Ivar used his mind like a blade, Bjorn used his blade like, well, a blade, and a pretty terrifying one at that. His nickname, Ironside, came from his seemingly invincible nature in battle. Swords broke against him, axes splintered, arrows simply bounced off. Was it armor, divine protection, or just really good genetics? No one knew, and no one dared ask. As a young man, Bjorn sailed with his father on many raids, particularly along the coasts of France, then known as West Francia. These early campaigns were a crucible, forging his courage and sharpening his instincts. He watched how Ragnar led, how he inspired warriors, not just with promises of silver and loot, but with dreams of legend. Bjorn absorbed it all, his father's charisma, cunning, and chaos. And then Ragnar died, thrown into a pit of snakes by King Ella of Northumbria. Ragnar left behind a void and 4 very, very angry sons. Bjorn joined his brothers in forming the great heathen army, the largest Viking force ever to sail to England. Their goal was not just plunder, it was vengeance. Together they ravaged the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. They burned cities, broke armies, and eventually captured King Ella. His execution by the infamous Blood Eagle was brutal, symbolic, and personal. But for Bjorn, this wasn't the end. While his brothers focused on ruling and expanding their presence in England, Bjorn's heart looked elsewhere. It looked south. By the mid-800s, Bjorn Ironside was no longer a hot-headed prince. He was a commander, a seasoned sea king, and a man restless for something more than the gray skies and icy fjords of Scandinavia. He partnered with Hastein, another ambitious Viking warrior, and together they launched one of the most insanely bold expeditions in Viking history. Their fleet, possibly numbering over 60 ships, didn't just raid the coast of France or sail the Irish Sea. No, dear dreamer. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and entered the Mediterranean Sea, a place very few Norsemen had ever dared to explore. Imagine it: bronze sunshine, palm trees, spices silk, and cities filled with marble and gold. Vikings in the land of olives and empires. And these weren't just sightseeing tourists. They brought fire and fury. Their first stops, Algeciras, Cadiz, and Seville, part of Muslim, ruled Al-Andalus. The local defenders were fierce, but Bjorn and his crew fought with the madness of men who had crossed half the known world. They sacked, pillaged, and moved on like a storm. They then turned their attention south. Yes, south, raiding parts of North Africa, including cities in Morocco. It is one of the few recorded instances of Viking raids on African soil. And just when you think they'd turn back, nope, they weren't even close to done. Now comes the most famous and theatrical tale from their Mediterranean escapade, the raid on Rome. Except, as we now know, it wasn't Rome. It was Luna, a wealthy city in northern Italy that just happened to look Roman enough for the Vikings to say, yeah, close enough. Unable to breach Luna's walls, Bjorn and Hastein hatched the most audacious Viking con ever. Hastein pretended to die. His men begged the city to let them give their beloved leader a Christian burial inside the walls. The city, moved by the devotion and unaware that Vikings were the original Oscar winners, agreed. And so a solemn funeral procession entered the city, and then Bjorn and Hastein jumped out of the coffin swords, blazing, and flung the gates open. The city fell. Luna was sacked. Was it really Bjorn? Maybe, maybe not, but honestly, I hope so, because that story is art. Bjorn's path through the Mediterranean wasn't without peril. In southern France, he was almost trapped by the forces of King Charles I. The Frankish army blocked the river mouth, trapping Bjorn's fleet inland. So, what did Bjorn do? Set his ships on fire. He created a giant smoke screen, used the cover to rebuild a smaller fleet inland, and escaped through a side channel like the Viking Houdini he was. Savage, stylish, successful. After years of raiding, exploring, and redefining Viking ambition, Bjorn returned north. He didn't fade into obscurity. He didn't go quietly. He became king of Sweden, specifically the region around Lake Mälaren, where the house of Munso was born, a dynasty many credit him with founding. He ruled wisely, expanded trade, and governed not as a raider, but as a builder. He had seen the wider world, and he used that knowledge to strengthen his own. His legend spread across Europe, whispered by priests, sailors, and kings. His name, like iron, was unbreakable. Bjorn Ironside's death is uncertain, like much of Viking history. Some say he died peacefully, a gray-bearded king in his hall, surrounded by gold suns and stories. Others say he perished at sea, his long ship swallowed by the waves he loved. And some say he sleeps in the mound at Munso, buried beneath the earth. He once ruled sword in hand, eyes closed, ready to rise should the world ever need him again. Bjorn Ironside was not just a man. He was a movement, a prince who became a warrior who became a myth who became a monarch. He showed the world that Vikings could do more than pillage. They could conquer, command, and dream beyond the horizon. Sleep now, dear dreamer. Let your dreams drift through salt spray and starlight, and if you hear oars in the dark or the distant roar of iron against shield, don't worry. It's just Bjorn Ironside riding the tide between legend and eternity. Eric the Red, the exile who discovered a land of ice and called it green, in a time when the world was only half known and the rest was just rumor and imagination. When ships sliced across the sea like dragon-headed prayers to the gods, there lived a man with hair the color of fresh spilled blood and a temper just as fiery. They called him Eric the Red, and oh dear dreamer, he earned that name. Eric's tale begins around the year 950 A.D. in the rugged fjords of Norway, under skies heavy with snow and prophecy. He was born Eric Thorvaldsson, the son of Thorvald Asvaldsson, a man who, like many in his family, had trouble keeping a low profile. In fact, Thorvald was exiled from Norway for manslaughter. Yes, we're off to a flying start already, and took little Eric and the rest of the fam across the sea to Iceland, the wild western outpost of Viking society at the time. Eric grew up among volcanoes, wind ice, and wolves. The land was harsh, and so were its people. But Eric, he was harsher. He had bright red hair, a full beard like fire, and eyes that could freeze a man solid at 20 paces. He was passionate, prideful, and when insulted, terrifying. And just like his father before him, he got himself into, well, let's call it a situation. In his early adult years, Eric lived on a farm in Iceland with his wife, Theodilda. Say that 3 times fast, and their growing family, which included a certain freckle-faced little boy named Leif Erikson, who we'll get to another night, don't worry. But Eric had a problem with his neighbors. They didn't get along. Disputes turned to violence. Swords were drawn, and before long Eric found himself guilty of killing multiple men over land and property disputes. You know the usual. For this, he was exiled from Iceland for 3 years. But did Eric cry? Did he retreat into shame? No, no, no. He looked west. Eric had heard tales of a mysterious land to the west of Iceland, a frozen, rugged place sighted decades earlier by a Norse sailor named Gunnbjorn Ulfsson, who was blown off course during a storm. No one had ever settled it. No one knew what it truly was. But Eric, he smelled opportunity, and more importantly, he smelled freedom. So, in the year 982, he packed up his ships, gathered his loyal crew, and set sail into the great unknown, where glaciers rose like sleeping giants, and the ocean whispered secrets that only madmen and heroes could understand. What he found was a land of ice stone and silence, a place so cold it could crack bones, so empty it swallowed sound. It was Greenland, and Eric, the exile, the outlaw, claimed it. Now let's talk about that name, because Eric was a marketing genius. When he returned to Iceland after his exile, he told everyone he'd found a bountiful, fertile land, green and open, perfect for farming and settling. Was it true? Not really. Greenland is mostly covered in ice and rock, with only a few habitable areas along the coast. But Eric, ever the salesman, called it Greenland because, in his words, people would be more likely to go there if it had a pleasant name. Literal Viking propaganda. And it worked. In 985, Eric led 25 ships back to Greenland to start a permanent colony. Only 14 made it, the rest lost to storms and the sea. But still, that was enough. They built farms, settlements. Eric declared himself chief of the eastern settlement. He had found a new kingdom at the edge of the world. He had turned exile into empire. Greenland was no paradise. Winters were brutal, crops scarce, and isolation complete. But Eric ruled like a true Norse chieftain, harsh but fair, proud, and unyielding. He oversaw the building of Brattahlid, his homestead in the eastern settlement, and organized the community with the help of his wife and sons. One of those sons, of course, was Leif Erikson, the man who would later sail even further west and become the first European to set foot in North America hundreds of years before Columbus ever stumbled onto anything. You could say that Eric raised his children on tales of boldness and the thrill of the unknown. In a house built at the edge of the world, every dinner conversation was probably like, "So, who are we conquering tomorrow?" But not all changes came by sword or storm. Around this time, Christianity began to make its way to Greenland. Leif, after traveling abroad, converted and brought his new faith back home. His mother, Theodilda, embraced it. She even had a church built on their land against Eric's wishes. You see, Eric was a staunch pagan, a believer in Odin Thor and the old ways. The tension between father and son, between the old gods and the new, cast a long shadow over Eric's later years. He refused to enter the church. Some say it caused a permanent rift in the family. But perhaps in some quiet part of his heart, Eric the Red knew the world he had ruled was beginning to change. Eric the Red is believed to have died sometime around 1003 AD, possibly from illness, perhaps from sorrow, or even quietly like an old wolf, lying down in the snow, staring out across the land he had named. He never returned to Iceland. He never converted to Christianity. And he never apologized for who he was. So who was Eric the Red? A murderer, a visionary, a tyrant, a trailblazer. Yes, all of it. He was the embodiment of the Viking spirit, restless, ambitious, flawed, and bold. A man who turned exile into exploration, who looked into the icy unknown and saw not fear, but freedom. He didn't build cathedrals. He didn't write laws. But he changed the map, and in doing so, He gave the world Greenland and raised a son who would push even further to lands that lay sleeping under forests and starlight. So rest now, dear dreamer of flame and frost. Let the snow fall soft across your thoughts. Let the firelight crackle beside your heart. And remember, even the most untamed soul can find a home, even if they have to build it at the edge of the world. Leif Erikson, the Viking who found a new world. In the land of snow and smoke, where wolves howled to the auroras, and the sea carved the shores like runes from the gods, there was once a boy who was not born to rule, nor to conquer, nor to destroy, but to discover. His name was Leif Erikson, and he would sail further than any Viking before him. Leif was born sometime around 970 A.D. in the windswept settlement of Brattahlid, Greenland. His father, Eric the Red, was a warrior, an exile, a chieftain, and the founder of Greenland itself. His mother, Theodilda, was strong, pious, and quietly wise. From the moment Leif could walk, he walked on the edge, literally. Greenland was the end of the known world. Beyond it, only mystery ice and the sea that devoured men whole. He learned to sail before he could write, learned to hunt in snowstorms, to read the sky and smell the wind. He was a quiet child, thoughtful, curious. While his father gloried in conquest and flame, Leif listened. He watched the horizon, and he wondered what lay beyond. As a young man, Leif set sail for Norway, the homeland his father had once been banished from. There he entered the court of King Olaf Tryggvason, a Christian ruler with a powerful presence and a fondness for converting pagan souls. Leif, ever open-minded, converted to Christianity. Olaf saw potential in him, not just as a warrior, but as a messenger. He tasked Leif with bringing the Christian faith back to Greenland. So, Leif loaded up with priests, sacred books, and holy intentions, and set off for home. But the sea, as always, had other plans. Somewhere along that voyage, Leif was blown off course, or perhaps he heard a tale from a storm-wrecked sailor. Accounts vary, but what matters is this. He heard whispers of a strange land far to the west, a land with forests, rivers, grapes, grain, a land where the cold was kinder and the earth more generous. That land had been spotted once before by another Norseman, Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had glimpsed it from a distance, but hadn't dared to land. But Leif dared. Around the year 1000 A.D., Leif Erikson set sail into the west with a crew of 35 brave men. Guided by stars, seabirds, and ancient instincts, they passed icebergs, crossed stormy seas, and finally they saw it, a shore lined with forest rivers, teeming with salmon land as green as any Viking had seen. They landed in what is now believed to be Newfoundland, Canada, or possibly further south along the Atlantic coast. They called it Vinland, the land of vines, because of the wild grapes found there. It was paradise, or so it seemed. The crew built houses, a winter camp they called Leif's booths. They fished, hunted, explored. They encountered new animals, possibly even new people, the native Beothuk, or other indigenous peoples. Though these encounters, according to the sagas, were cautious and sometimes tense. Leif and his men stayed for a season, maybe two, but despite the beauty, they knew they could not yet stay. The pull of home, of Greenland and family, was too strong, so they packed their ships with timber, grapes, curiosities, and stories, and returned home, becoming the first known Europeans to set foot in North America over 500 years before Columbus ever messed up his directions. Back in Greenland, Leif's discoveries made him a legend. He became Leif the Lucky, a nickname he earned not only for surviving the voyage, but for the life that followed. He fulfilled his king's request and brought Christianity to Greenland. His mother converted and had a church built, Theodilda's church, still remembered in saga and stone. But Eric the Red, the old pagan, never followed his son into the new faith. A rift opened between them, between old gods and new ways, between the past and the future. Leif never became a king. He didn't conquer or rule. Instead, he explored, he inspired, and he quietly changed the world. Leif Erikson died in Greenland, likely around 1020 A.D., though the exact date is lost in the mists. His grave has never been found. No grand burial mound marks his resting place. But in a way, he didn't need one. His true monument is the memory of Vinland and every explorer who followed his path west. So, who was Leif Erikson? He was the son of a fury raised on the edge of the world, who looked not for war, but for wonder. He was a man who heard a rumor and turned it into reality. A sailor who listened to the ocean's secrets and answered them with sails. And tonight, dear dreamer, as you drift between waking and wonder, remember, some heroes carry swords, others carry curiosity, and it is often the quieter ones, the ones who do not burn cities or sit on thrones, who shape the world in ways that last the longest. Freydis Eiriksdottir, flame, daughter of the north. In the shadowy folds of time, where memory gives way to myth, and the northern winds carry stories older than stone, The name of Freydis Eiriksdottir flickers like a torch in the dark. She was born into a world carved by cold and forged in fire in the Greenlandic settlement of Brattahlid, where the snow lay thick upon the mountains and the sea was a silver road to unknown worlds. Her father, Eric the Red, was infamous across the north for carving a new homeland out of exile and ice. Her brother Leif Erikson would one day sail to lands no European had seen before, but Freydis, she would go her own way. From her earliest years, Freydis seemed to carry both fire and frost in her blood. Where others stayed silent, she spoke. Where others waited, she acted. The sagas, sparse though they are, with details, agree on one thing. She was not to be trifled with. Her temper could snap like a frozen branch underfoot, but so too could her strength rise when the world demanded it. She was not just the daughter of a notorious settler. She was a woman of her own making, one whose legacy would be shaped not by diplomacy or dreams, but by survival fury and an unshakable will. The stories that have come down to us tell of Freydis's journey to Vinland, an expedition that placed her among the rarest of Viking women, those who sailed into the unknown. By the time she made her own voyage, her brother Leif had already found the lush, forested coasts of the far west, the land the Norse would call Vinland, a world apart from the icy rocks of Greenland. Inspired by the promise of fertile land, and perhaps by a thirst to make her own mark on the world, Freydis entered into a partnership with two Icelandic men, Helgi and Finnbogi, agreeing to join forces for a colonizing mission to this promising territory. From the beginning, the journey was tense. Freydis arrived in Vinland with her own ship, her own crew, and her own vision of what life there would be. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, she and her partners disagreed from the start over resources, respect, and who had the right to claim what. Although they had promised to share equally in the journey's bounty, Freydis believed herself to have been slighted, and from that grievance, violence soon followed. In a chilling turn, the saga claims she ordered her husband and crew to massacre the Icelandic men while they slept. When her people hesitated to harm the women of the other camp, Freydis reportedly picked up an axe herself and completed the deed. She then threatened her own crew with death if they ever told the story. Upon their return, it's hard to know how much of this tale is true. The sagas were written centuries after the events they describe, steeped in the biases and storytelling traditions of a male-dominated culture. Whether Freydis was a villainous schemer, a shrewd survivor, or something in between, remains a matter of debate. But even if the tale is exaggerated, it speaks to the sheer force of her personality in the Norse imagination. She wasn't written as an accessory to history. She was the history, bold, bloody, and utterly unforgettable. There's another tale of Freydis that reveals a different kind of courage. In the saga of Eric the Red, she joins another voyage to Vinland, this time alongside her brothers and other settlers. During one expedition, the group came under attack by the local indigenous population. As chaos broke out and the Norsemen began to flee, Freydis, heavily pregnant and completely unarmed, refused to run. Instead, she found the body of a fallen Viking, took up his sword, and turned to face the attackers herself. Then, in a moment that now reads like something out of legend, she tore open her bodice, beat her chest with the sword, and let out a roar, so furious, so primal, that the attackers, according to the saga, fled in terror. Again, whether this scene happened exactly as told, we cannot know, but the image is indelible. Here was a woman untrained in war, carrying life within her body, yet unafraid to stand alone on the battlefield. It wasn't just bravery, it was a statement. Freydis did not see herself as weaker than the men around her. She did not accept retreat. She turned the battlefield into a place of power, claiming space with sword and scream. After Vinland, Freydis fades from the sagas like many figures of her time. Her end is lost to the silence of the centuries. There is no record of where or when she died. No burial mound stands in her name. And yet she lingers more present than many who wore crowns or held kingdoms. Her legend survived in the whispers of the sagas carried by storytellers and sea winds, and now in your imagination too. Freydis Eriksdottir was not a perfect heroine, but then perfection has never been the hallmark of true legacy. She was flawed, fierce, capable of brutality and courage in equal measure. In a time when women were expected to wait at home, she sailed to the edge of the world. When others ran, she stood. When stories tried to tame her, she left them scorched. So, as you drift to sleep now, dear dreamer of storm-tossed seas and strong-willed hearts, remember her. Not as a woman who followed, but as one who forged her own fate with blade in hand and fire in her eyes. Gunnar Hamundarson, the gentle warrior of Iceland, in the green valleys and sharp mountains of medieval Iceland, where the law was spoken aloud beneath the sky, and justice rode on horseback with a sword at its hip, there lived a man named Gunnar Hamundarson, of Lidarendi. He was a man whose name came to stand for strength, for loyalty, for tragic beauty, and ultimately for a kind of nobility that would not bow to fear. Born in the 10th century, Gunnar was the son of Hamundur Gunnarsson, and though his blood was noble, it was not royal. He was not born to a throne or crowned by destiny. What made Gunnar different, what made him unforgettable, was not just his strength or skill, but the balance he struck between warrior and poet, between the sword and the song. Tall, broad-shouldered, and strikingly handsome, Gunnar could leap higher than any man in Iceland so high. The sagas say that he could jump to his own height, while fully armed, even backward, over his own shield. He was the kind of man who made enemies nervous and allies proud. His presence at an assembly could calm tempers or ignite them, depending on which way the wind of his will blew. He was not boastful. He was not cruel, but if wronged, he would not hesitate to draw blood. And if honor was on the line, he would risk everything. Gunnar's tale unfolds within the Njals saga, one of the most intricate and emotionally rich of all Icelandic sagas. And at the heart of it is his deep friendship with Njal Thorgeirsson, a wise and peace-loving lawyer whose advice Gunnar trusted as if it came from the gods themselves. Njal and Gunnar were opposites in many ways, one a man of law and words, the other of action and arms. But their bond was unshakable until the world around them pulled it taut. In time, Gunnar married Hallgerdur Höskuldsdóttir, a woman of renowned beauty and fiery pride. But her past was troubled, and her temper, like Gunnar's blade, was swift. Their marriage was passionate and strained a storm waiting for lightning. Hallgerdur is a saga character of her own kind, fascinating, sharp, and dangerous when crossed. And as we shall see, it would be her will that helped carve Gunnar's fate. Though Gunnar tried to stay out of the feuds that plagued Iceland's chieftains, and farmers' conflict eventually caught up to him, as it always does in the sagas. He killed in self-defense. He fought with honor, but even the noblest warrior cannot fight forever without consequence. Eventually, a blood feud began to build around him like thunderclouds on the horizon. Njal, ever the voice of peace, urged Gunnar to leave Iceland to go abroad for 3 winters, as the law allowed, and let tempers cool. Gunnar agreed. He prepared his ship, made his goodbyes, and rode away with a heavy heart. But as he crossed the ridge of a nearby mountain and looked back at his home in Halidarendi, the valley shining beneath a clear sky, the fields swaying like waves, the land he loved so deeply, he paused. He turned to his companion and said the words that sealed his fate. fagurt liden sva at mer, hefir aldri fyr, thot sva fagurt blekir akrar, ox legin tun, ok mun ek rida, heim after ok fara vergi. And with that, he chose to stay. He broke the terms of his exile, not out of arrogance, but out of love for his land, his home, his roots. And in doing so, he placed himself outside the protection of the law. Soon after, his enemies came for him. The final scene of Gunnar's life is among the most iconic in all Norse literature. Surrounded at his farmhouse by a force of enemies far greater than he could fight alone, he defended his home with the strength of 10 men. Arrows flew, spears shattered. Gunnar fought from the doorway like a force of nature, cutting down attackers with his mighty bow and sword. But then his bowstring snapped. He turned to Hallgerdr, the woman he had once slapped for stealing the woman whose pride he had bruised, and asked her for strands of her hair to repair his bowstring. She refused. She looked him in the eye and said coldly, "I remember the slap." And so, left without his weapon, Gunnar met his end as his enemies finally overwhelmed him. He died standing surrounded by the bodies of those he'd slain with blood on his hands, but not on his soul. And even his enemies, when it was over, mourned his passing. In the centuries since, Gunnar Hamundarson has become more than a historical figure. He is a symbol of doomed nobility, of a man caught between loyalty and law love and pride, friendship and fate. He reminds us that not all sagas are about glory. Some are about the cost of choosing home over safety, honor over exile, beauty over vengeance. He is Iceland's Achilles, Iceland's Hector, a warrior with a poet's soul and a tragic end. And tonight, as you close your eyes, let the sound of the wind in the grass carry you to that green hillside. Let the memory of fair Hlíðarendi whisper through your dreams. Eric Bloodaxe, the last Viking king, the world into which Eric Haraldsson was born, was one of frost and fire. It was the late 9th century, and the North still roared with the pulse of the Viking Age. Long ships haunted the coasts of Europe like ghosts carved from oak. Swords spoke louder than laws, and kings, well, kings, were made by axe oath and battlefield blessings. Eric was the son of Harald Fairhair, the first king to unite Norway under one crown. Harald was legendary, proud, and prolific, very prolific. He had no fewer than 20 sons born of various wives and concubines. It was less a royal family and more a small army. Among them, Eric stood out. He was bold, fearless, striking in appearance, with long dark hair and a gaze that could silence a hall. And from an early age he was trained in the arts of leadership, war, and poetic brutality. But even in a family of warriors, Eric's ruthlessness made him infamous, and his nickname, Bloodaxe, was not just for show. According to sagas, Eric began his journey to kingship in the most Viking way possible, by killing his brothers. Not all of them, just the inconvenient ones. It's said he murdered several of his siblings to clear the path to power, possibly encouraged by his father or simply propelled by his own ambition. One by one they fell, and by the time the blood stopped flowing, Eric had claimed the Norwegian throne as king after Harald's death. But ruling Norway was no easy task. The land was vast, wild, and filled with powerful jarls and petty kings who didn't particularly like being told what to do. Eric ruled with a heavy hand, determined to crush opposition. Yet, despite his ferocity in battle, his reign did not last long. Enter Håkon the Good, his half-brother, raised in England by King Athelstan, and a man known more for diplomacy and charm than for carving up siblings like roast meat. Håkon returned to Norway with the blessing of the English court and quickly gained support. The people, weary of Eric's iron rule, turned to Håkon, and so Eric was forced to flee, exiled from his own kingdom. But the saga doesn't end there. Eric crossed the sea and landed in the kingdom of Northumbria in northern England. At this time, Northumbria was a land of political chaos, torn between Anglo-Saxon kings and Viking settlers. It had once been a great kingdom, but by the 10th century it was a battleground of alliances and backstabbing. And into that chaos strode Eric Bloodaxe, dripping with charisma and experience, bearing the scars of battles past, and wearing his exile like a crown of fire. The English, particularly King Athelstan, welcomed him not as a guest, but as a tool. A Viking king, powerful but exiled, was the perfect man to control the northern territories. Eric became king of Northumbria, at least in part, but his reign was always tenuous, balanced on the shifting tides of politics. He ruled once, was deposed, then returned to power, then was deposed again. His enemies were many, his allies few. But still he held on, as all true Vikings do, by the edge of his blade. And by his side stood a woman as fierce as he was. Her name was Gunhild, often called Mother of Kings. She is one of the most fascinating, powerful women in Viking lore. Some said she was a sorceress, others a seductress. All agreed that she was not to be underestimated. Gunhild was said to be clever, sharp-tongued, and politically savvy. She bore Eric many sons and guided his reign from behind the scenes. The sagas credit her with advising Eric on statecraft vengeance and even magical warfare, where Eric brought blood and steel, Gunhild brought cunning and fire. Together, they were a power couple like no other, royal, ruthless, and doomed. Eric's end came in 954 AD when he was finally defeated near Stainmore in the bleak hills between Cumbria and Northumbria. Betrayed by former allies, surrounded by enemies, and cut off from any hope of rescue, Eric and his remaining loyal men made a final stand. They fought valiantly, but it was not enough. Eric Bloodaxe, the last Viking king of Northumbria, fell in battle, just as a true Viking should. His body was likely buried hastily, perhaps, by the very men who had once bowed to him. The exact location of his grave is unknown, but his name lived on in Norse poetry. He was remembered with pride in Anglo-Saxon records, with fear, and in the Icelandic sagas, with a sort of lingering awe reserved only for those who lived too fiercely to be forgotten. Eric Bloodaxe was a man of contradictions, a brutal king who ruled with the sword, a son who murdered his brothers to secure power, an exile who became a king again, a warrior who lost everything but still died standing. He is remembered as the last gasp of Viking kingship in England, the final storm before the Saxons took hold of the north for good. His blood may have stained the stones of Stainmore, but his legend bled into the roots of history. And tonight, dear dreamer, as you slip into the velvet silence of sleep, let your mind sail with Eric across the stormy seas of exile and ambition. Egil Skallagrimsson, the warrior who wrote the world in verse. In the far north on an island, carved by wind and volcano, where the sea crashes endlessly against cliffs, and the sky changes its mood 100 times a day, there lived a man whose heart beat in rhythm with both sword and song. His name was Egil Skallagrimsson, and he was many things: a killer, a poet, a father, a farmer, a fugitive, a friend. But above all, he was unforgettable. He was born around the year 904 in the wilds of Iceland, a land only recently settled by Norse explorers and exiles from Norway. His father, Skallagrimur Kveld Ulfsson, was a powerful chieftain, known for his strength and ferocity, and descended from a line of men who, if the stories are to be believed, carried something animal and dark in their blood. His mother Bera was wise and sharp, a woman who managed to soften the edges of her husband and quietly shape the early years of her son. But Egil did not take after her. According to the Eagle's Saga, one of the greatest masterpieces of medieval Icelandic literature, Egil was not like other children. While most boys played with wooden swords and sheep bones, Egil was composing skaldic poetry by the age of 3. Not just rhymes, mind you, but full verse, structured metaphorical complex. His first poem was recorded when he was refused a drink at a feast. Instead of crying, Egil stared the offender down, spat a verse at him so sharp it could have drawn blood, and sat back down with the calm of a little demon. It was in a way his first battle, and soon the rest would follow. By the age of 7, Egil had already killed a boy over a game. The sagas do not describe him as monstrous, but as relentless. He was born with a berserker's fury inside him, one that sometimes ignited without warning. The same boy who could cradle a harp and write laments for fallen friends could in the next moment break a man's skull for an insult. His family worried. His father despaired. But there was no stopping the fire that burned within Egil. As a young man, he joined his older brother Thorolfur on journeys abroad, first to Norway, where Egil's trouble would begin anew. Norway was ruled at the time by King Eric Bloodaxe and his formidable wife Gunhild, often called Mother of Kings. And if there was one person in the entire world less tolerant of Egil's antics than his own father, it was Gunhild. The trouble started when Egil insulted one of Gunhild's relatives publicly. That relative responded by killing one of Egil's closest friends. Egil, in turn, responded by killing the man looting his body and composing a brutal poem about it, just in case anyone missed the message. Gunhild was enraged. King Eric ordered Egil's execution, but Egil, with the energy of someone who thrives on being hated, simply kept fighting. He killed Eric's own son in a duel and another of the king's men. After that, it was one of the boldest, most dangerous feuds in Viking history, and yet Egil somehow stayed one step ahead of death. Captured at last, he found himself before the throne of Eric and Gunhild. Death was certain, but Egil asked for one final night to compose a poem, and in the hours that followed, he crafted one of the finest examples of Norse praise poetry ever recorded, Hufudlausen, or Head Ransom. The poem was so brilliant, so carefully crafted in its rhythm and imagery, that even King Eric, sworn enemy of Egil, was moved. He spared Egil's life. That's right, Egil literally poemed his way out of execution. It's one of the most jaw-dropping power moves in literary history. In his wanderings, Egil also served under King Athelstan of England during one of the most famous battles of the age, the Battle of Brunanburh, where Athelstan's forces clashed with a coalition of Scots Vikings and Welsh forces. Egil fought with thunderous fury, earning deep respect from the English king, who rewarded him with gold and gifts. But while he had kings as allies, Egil also made enemies wherever he went. He sued, he fought, he wrote, and he never forgot a slight. His life was an unbroken chain of legal cases and axe-swinging episodes. Even the courtrooms of Iceland weren't safe from his temper. He once carved a curse poem into a pole and raised it at the top of a hill to hex his enemies with verse and vengeance. Egil wasn't just a fighter or a poet. He was a force of nature, a man who weaponized everything he had: his fists, his sword, his mind, and his mouth. But not all the sagas of Egil are soaked in violence. Some are steeped in sorrow. When Egil's young son drowned at sea, his grief was profound. For days he refused food, refused to speak. It was only when he began to write that the pain found its voice. The result was Sona Torek, Loss of a Son, a poem so raw and filled with anguish that it remains one of the most beautiful elegies in any language. In it, Egil does not blame his enemies or the gods. He simply mourns, unflinching, with the full weight of his soul. The poem reveals another side of the berserker, one not fueled by rage, but by love, grief, and the agony of a heart broken beyond mending. It's one of the earliest examples of personal emotional poetry in the European tradition, and it came from the same man who once cracked open a man's skull with an axe just to win a horse. In his old age, Egil slowed, but he never softened. Blind, stooped, and sickly, he could still recite his own verses from memory, his voice rumbling like thunder in a quiet hall. He spent his final years at Borg, the estate in Iceland his father had built, surrounded by family poetry and the long memory of his own legend. When he died, the sagas say he was buried with treasure, and perhaps more importantly, with the full weight of his life carved into the bones of Icelandic history. So who was Egil Skallagrimsson? He was a berserker with a harp, a man whose fists could break bone, but whose words could unmake grief. He was fury given form and sorrow given rhythm. A man born in a time of violence who somehow found a way to feel deeply and fight fiercely and never once chose between them. He did not conquer empires. He didn't die a king, but his words, his stories, and his staggering contradictions made him something even rarer. He became unforgettable. Harold Bluetooth, the king who left his name on history and your Wi-Fi. There once lived a man whose voice could command armies, whose faith changed nations, and whose name would echo through time, not just in rune stones, but in the palm of your hand, flashing blue in the corner of your phone. His name was Harold Bluetooth, and while he ruled long before electricity ever crackled through a wire, his story is one of connection, unification, and the delicate dance between old gods and new. He was born in the early 10th century, likely around 910 to 920 A.D., in the royal halls of Denmark. His father was Gorm the Old, a fierce and unapologetically pagan king who ruled with strength and tradition. His mother was Thyra, a woman said to be wise and politically astute, often credited in sagas with strengthening the realm through her cleverness and caution. From a young age, Harold was caught between two worlds, the brutal axe-wielding legacy of Norse tradition and the creeping tide of Christianity that was sweeping through the courts of Europe, while Denmark still clung to its gods of thunder and war kings. In neighboring lands were kneeling before bishops and baptizing their sons. Harold would live and reign at the crossroads of this cultural collision. Harold came to power following the death of his father sometime around 958 A.D. According to legend and the famous gelling stones, his father Gorm had refused to convert to Christianity, even when it was politically advantageous. Harold, on the other hand, was more pragmatic. Shortly after assuming the throne, Harold converted to Christianity. Whether this was due to genuine belief or political maneuvering is unclear, but the consequences were enormous. He publicly declared Denmark a Christian kingdom, marking one of the most significant cultural shifts in Scandinavian history. He ordered the construction of churches, brought in missionaries, and even claimed to have converted all of Denmark and Norway, though the latter may be a slight exaggeration. He was a king, not a miracle worker. This conversion was immortalized in stone specifically, in the gelling rune stones still standing today. One of them reads, King Harold bade these memorials to be made after Gorm, his father, and Thyra, his mother, that Harold, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christian. But Harold was more than just a king who swapped Thor for Jesus. He was a unifier of kingdoms, beliefs, and technologies. Harold didn't unify Denmark with words alone. His reign was marked by numerous military campaigns, both offensive and defensive. He strengthened Denmark's borders, built massive fortresses, known as Trelleborgs, with perfect circular shapes and uncanny precision. These ring fortresses were part military installation, part statement piece. Come for the glory, stay for the central drainage system. He also fortified the Danevirke, a sprawling defensive wall in southern Denmark to protect against encroaching German forces. This move wasn't just military, it was cultural. It was Harold asserting in stone and soil that Denmark was a distinct, sovereign power, even as Christendom grew around it. And yet, Harold wasn't just swinging a sword. He was shaking hands when he wasn't chopping them off. He forged alliances, navigated the increasingly complex web of European politics, and maintained ties with both the Holy Roman Empire and other Norse rulers. Like his namesake technology, he was all about connection, sometimes peaceful, sometimes not. Now let's pause for the million-kroner question. What's with the nickname? The exact origin of the name Bluetooth Blotand in Old Norse is a bit of a mystery. Some say he had a dead or darkened tooth, possibly literally blue or blackened by decay or injury. Others suggest the name reflected his fondness for blueberries or strong drink, less majestic, but very human. Either way, the name stuck, and it eventually inspired a 1990s team of Scandinavian tech engineers who thought, let's name our wireless communication project after a guy who unified warring tribes and got them talking to each other. Yes, that's 100% real. The Bluetooth symbol you see on your phone, it's a bind rune of H and B, Harold Bluetooth's initials in Old Norse runes. The man literally became a tech logo. No other Viking can say that. For all his strengths, Harold's reign didn't end in glory. In his later years, his kingdom faced pressure from both internal and external enemies. Most painfully, he faced rebellion from his own son, Sweyn Forkbeard. Sweyn was ambitious, clever, and possibly fed up with his father's Christian reforms and increasingly centralized rule. Around 986 to 987 A.D., he rose in rebellion and forced Harold to flee. Wounded in battle, perhaps by an arrow, Harold escaped south to the land of the Slavs, where he died shortly after. He was buried far from his royal seat, the crown taken by the very son who had overthrown him. History, as ever, has little patience for sentiment. But Harold's story did not end there. His rune stones still stand. His churches still whisper of his reforms. And the wireless connections we use every day still bear his name. So, who was Harold Bluetooth? He was a warrior, yes, but also a builder, a dreamer, a man who could look at a fractured kingdom and imagine it whole. He stood at the fault line of the pagan and Christian worlds, and somehow kept his footing. He carved his victories into stone so deeply that they still cast shadows today. He didn't end with a blaze of glory. He ended with betrayal, with exile, with pain. But kings are not judged only by how they die, but by what they leave behind. And Harold Bluetooth left behind a unified kingdom, a Christianized Denmark, and accidentally a name that would one day blink beside your earbuds. Now sleep, dear dreamer of stone and signal. Let the hum of your devices fade into the quiet of the fjords. Let the glow of the Bluetooth rune guide you not to connection speeds or Wi-Fi pairing, but to the memory of a king who bound the North together like thread through a cloak. Canute the Great, the Viking, who ruled an empire and told the sea to behave. In the early 11th century, while most Viking kings were still raiding monasteries and brawling over fjords, one man looked at the map and said, "Why not have it all?" His name was Canute, sometimes spelled Canute, and he was not content with being king of one kingdom when three would do just fine. He would go on to rule over Denmark, Norway, and England, forging what came to be known as the North Sea Empire, a personal union of territories that stretched across the cold waters like a crown of storms. But he didn't rule like a wild berserker. He ruled with calculation, with diplomacy, with surprising elegance. Canute wasn't just a warrior. He was a world-class chess player in a game where the pieces were made of steel and souls. And yet, he began as so many legends do not as a ruler, but as a second son. Canute was born around 990 AD, likely in Denmark, the son of King Sweyn Forkbeard, a man famous for being one of the first Viking rulers to conquer and rule England, and Świętosława, a Polish princess of royal blood. His upbringing was steeped in the tension between sword and scripture, Viking power, and Christian diplomacy. From the beginning, Canute walked the line between two worlds, speaking multiple languages, understanding multiple customs, and always calculating his next move. When Sweyn Forkbeard died in 1014, Canute was in England with an army trying to secure his father's recent conquest. The English, however, were not feeling generous. They expelled Canute and welcomed back Ethelred the Unready, the previously exiled Anglo-Saxon king. But Canute wasn't finished. Oh no. He left, gathered more ships, recruited fresh warriors from Scandinavia, and returned a year later not to raid, but to conquer. In 1015, Canute launched a full-scale invasion of England. It was a bloody, methodical campaign. He crushed opposition, seized land, and ultimately defeated Edmund Ironside, Ethelred's son and heir, at the Battle of Assandun in 1016. Rather than completely destroying the Anglo-Saxon dynasty, Cnut agreed to divide the kingdom. He would rule the north and Edmund the south. But within a few months, Edmund died. Some say it was illness, others whisper of assassination. History, ever mysterious, offers no clear answer. What we do know is that by the end of 1016, Cnut was King of England, and unlike other conquerors, he stayed. What followed was one of the most surprising reigns in medieval history. Cnut ruled England not as a foreign overlord, but as a clever, savvy monarch. He adopted Anglo-Saxon traditions, married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Ethelred, and ensured a smooth transition of power. He retained English laws and institutions, paid generous tribute to the Church, and punished only those who resisted him directly. He didn't just conquer England, he made it his own. And while he reigned in England, he also maintained rule over Denmark and eventually Norway, which he wrestled from the hands of Harald Hardrada's predecessors. His empire spanned the North Sea, and for a shining moment in history, it looked as if a Scandinavian superpower had truly risen. Cnut held court with English earls, Danish jarls, and Norse chieftains. He minted coins, built churches, sent letters to the Pope, traded across Europe. Viking blood may have flowed in his veins, but it was diplomacy that ran through his fingers. Of all the legends told of Cnut, none is more famous or more misunderstood than the one about him commanding the tide. According to later accounts, Cnut once had his throne placed on the shore and commanded the incoming tide to halt, to prove that no king, no matter how powerful, could control the forces of nature. As the tide continued to rise, soaking his robes, Cnut turned to his courtiers and reminded them that only God held true power over the sea. This story has often been misrepresented as evidence of arrogance. In reality, it shows humility. Cnut knew the limits of kingship. He ruled not with delusions, but with perspective, and that may be why he ruled so effectively. Cnut died in 1035, at the height of his power in Winchester, one of England's ancient capitals. His death marked the beginning of the end for the North Sea Empire. His sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, could not hold the empire together. England would eventually return to Anglo-Saxon hands briefly, until the Norman conquest changed the game once again. But Cnut's reign was something extraordinary, a Viking who became a king, a conqueror who became a reformer, a man who could ride into a land with an axe and then rule it with a pen. He was in the end not remembered for bloodshed or rage, but for the peace he kept and the balance he held between worlds. So, Who was Knut the Great? He was not a berserker, not a brute. He was the storm that came ashore, and then became the shore itself. He brought the Viking world into the heart of Christian Europe and ruled with both strength and serenity. His name may have faded from school books, overshadowed by William the Conqueror and Alfred the Great, but his legacy is no less grand. For a brief, glittering moment, the cold waters of the North Sea carried the voice of a single ruler, a man who united kingdoms, quieted chaos, and reminded even the proudest of men that no one commands the tide. Harald Hardrada, the last Viking thunderstorm. In the year 1015, beneath skies gray with seagull cries and salted air, a child was born in Norway, who would grow to become one of the fiercest men to ever live. His name was Harald Sigurdsson, though history would remember him by the title that burned through every hall and saga, Harald Hardrada, Harald the Hard Ruler. He was born into chaos. Norway in the early 11th century was a land still soaked in the blood of ambition. His half-brother was Olaf II, later Saint Olaf, a fierce king trying to unify Norway under Christian rule. From childhood, Harald was steeped in tales of kings and conquerors, of gods and saints, and of bloodlines meant to carve the world into their shape. And as soon as he could lift a sword, Harald made it very, very clear. He was coming for it all. At just 15 years old, Harald joined his half-brother Olaf in battle at Stiklestad, one of the most legendary clashes in Norwegian history. Olaf was attempting to reclaim his throne from Danish control, but the battle turned into a slaughter. Olaf was killed, his army scattered, and Harald, he was wounded, barely escaped with his life, and fled into exile. But rather than wallowing in failure, young Harald did what any ambitious, axe-loving teenager would do. He took his talents abroad, and by abroad, I mean the Byzantine Empire, aka the Roman Empire 2.0, still thriving in the East. Harald journeyed to Kievan Rus, first joining the court of Prince Yaroslav the Wise. From there, he traveled to Constantinople, the jewel of the Mediterranean, and enlisted in the elite Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal Viking bodyguards. He didn't just serve, he excelled. Harald rose through the ranks like fire up dry timber. He fought in Sicily and Bulgaria, in the Holy Land. He crushed revolts, stormed castles, commanded fleets. The sagas claim he amassed great treasure, which he cleverly sent home for safekeeping. In Byzantium, they called him Araltes, and in true Harald style, he even got involved in a palace coup or two, probably broke several hearts, and possibly seduced an empress. I mean, this man lived for drama. But after almost a decade of glorious mayhem, Harold had done what he came to do, and he was ready to go home. Harold returned to Norway in 1045, richer than a dragon's hoard, and twice as dangerous. He came with ship's gold and experience few could match. But Norway already had a King Magnus the Good, also Saint Olaf's son, and Harold's nephew. Rather than plunge the country into war, Harold did what any ambitious uncle would do. He offered Magnus a deal. He'd co-rule Norway with him, or, destroy him. Magnus wisely agreed for a little while. In 1047, Magnus died mysteriously quickly, some might say. And Harold finally became sole king of Norway. But was that enough? Of course it wasn't. Harold ruled Norway with a mixture of iron-fisted authority and poetic flourish. He was a skald, a poet, just as much as he was a warrior. His verses, still preserved today, reflect a man who knew how to wield words with the same precision as his sword. He restructured the kingdom, reigned in the nobility, waged war against Denmark, crushed uprisings, built cities, strengthened trade. His rule was often hard but efficient, and he left his mark across Norway. But the fire inside him never cooled, not entirely. Because there was one more crown. He had his eye on one last glory to claim the crown of England. In 1066, King Edward the Confessor of England died without an heir. The throne was contested. Among the claimants were Harold Godwinson, England's powerful earl, and William of Normandy, future conqueror, and General Chaos Gremlin. But Harold Hardrada, who had no real claim other than "I want it, and I'm Harold Hardrada," decided this was his time. With the support of Tostig, the exiled brother of Harold Godwinson, Harold launched a full-scale invasion of England. He landed in the north with around 10,000 men and stormed through Yorkshire like it was his personal vineyard. He defeated an English army at Fulford, and all looked promising. He was poised to take the north of England. And then came Stamford Bridge. On the 25th of September, 1066, the English army led by Harold Godwinson marched 180 miles in just 4 days to surprise the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge. Harold had not expected this. His men were unarmored, many relaxing in the late summer sun. But he did not run. That wasn't his way. He leapt into battle with all the fury of his youth, swinging his massive two-handed sword, towering over his men. The sagas say he fought with such might and madness that he seemed invincible until an arrow pierced his throat. The last Viking king fell, not in retreat, not in exile, but in battle, like a true son of Odin. 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson would also fall at Hastings, and William of Normandy would take the English throne. But Harold Hardrada's death marked something even bigger, the end of the Viking Age. Harold Hardrada wasn't just a king, he was a living storm, a man of legend in his own time, a bridge between worlds, between the brutal poetic past of the sagas and the cold new dawn of medieval kingdoms. He left behind poems, fortresses, bloodlines, and one hell of a reputation. And though he died on foreign soil, though his crown was never laid upon England's throne, he remains the last great Viking to carve his name into history with blade and boldness. So now, dear dreamer, as your thoughts grow soft, and the waves of sleep roll gently toward your shores, imagine him standing tall upon the prow of his ship, his armor gleaming, sword in hand, singing verses to the sea. The storm is gone, but its thunder still echoes.